In 2014, in Mosul, in the courtyard of the ancient al-Nuri Grand Mosque, loudspeakers blared beneath the newly raised black flag. A sermon was delivered in the tone of someone who believed he was giving birth to a new order for the entire Islamic world. At the same time, on the barren slopes of Sinjar, the ground was gradually filled with unmarked graves, with children's sandals lying askew on the rocks, the last traces of those who would never return. How did a sermon at al-Nuri lead to an entire community being driven up a mountain to await death, women being turned into sex slaves, a group of people being deliberately wiped out solely because of their faith? If you have watched the previous episode on this channel about Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi as the portrait of an extremist individual, then in this episode we will step back to clearly see the crimes of the machine he led. We will go back to June 2014, when Mosul fell, when a caliphate was declared amid cheers and gunfire. From there, the journey runs along the roads linking Iraq and Syria, where a state was built on looted money, black market oil, and spreading fear, and then pauses in Sinjar, where Yazidis were torn from their families, sold, hunted down simply because their faith differed from the majority. This is not only the story of a terrorist organization, but the story of a state built on blood. And the price a small community had to pay so that the rest of the world would be forced to turn and look. When talking about the rise of the Islamic State, we cannot just look at a single sermon in Mosul and stop there. Behind that moment lie more than a decade of a land shredded by war, political mistakes, and power vacuums that no one took responsibility for filling. In Iraq, the turning point was 2003. The US military moved in, and the Ba'ath regime collapsed in just a few weeks. But that was not just a matter of changing the flag. The entire state apparatus was dismantled. The Ba'ath Party was dissolved, and hundreds of thousands of officers and soldiers, most of them Sunni, were suddenly pushed out of the system, losing their salaries and their honor, carrying a sense of being collectively punished for the crimes of a regime that many of them had not really believed in. On the ground, everyday life turned into a chain of checkpoints, roadside bombs, armored vehicles. People going to the market were no longer sure they would make it home in the afternoon. A few years later, across the border, Syria went up in flames in a different way. From peaceful protests in 2011, the country quickly slid into civil war. The map of power was torn into pieces. Government forces, countless rebel groups, extremist Islamist organizations, and gradually even foreign forces. Each area had its own flag, its own checkpoint, its own set of laws. In that context, ordinary people no longer cared who was right or wrong in political statements. They simply tried to survive each day, to avoid being kidnapped, shelled, or caught in the crossfire. What both stories have in common is this: the state, in the true sense of a system that protects its people and enforces justice, gradually disappeared from everyday life. Courts were weak, the police were seen as corrupt or powerless, the government in the capital talked more than it acted, and in villages and towns, people had to negotiate on their own with those who held the guns. When you are robbed, lose loved ones, lose your home, and there is no court you can trust, no flag you still respect, then any force that appears and promises to bring order will be listened to, even if that promise is written in blood. It was precisely in that power vacuum, from a shattered Iraq and a burning Syria, that a group calling itself the Islamic State stepped in and declared that only it could bring law, justice, and order. When IS is mentioned, many people only remember the black flags and the chilling propaganda videos. But to understand how it was able to set up a state right in the middle of the Middle East, we have to go back to some names that sound much drier. Al-Qaeda in Iraq? Then the Islamic State of Iraq, ISI. After the leader of al-Qaeda in Iraq was killed, this network did not disappear. It changed its name, changed its structure, went underground, and gathered the remaining fragments of jihadist groups, former fighters, former prisoners. A few new faces emerged, among them a little-known cleric who would later become the organization's supreme leader, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. From that foundation, the name Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, IS, gradually took shape. What made IS different from many previous terrorist groups is that it did not see itself only as an organization, but as a state in the full sense. At the top was the Caliph, the self-proclaimed supreme leader. Beneath him was the Shura Council, playing a role similar to a cabinet, in charge of strategic decisions. They set up a so-called Ministry of Defense to command the battlefield, a Ministry of Finance to manage looted money and taxes, a security apparatus to hunt down traitors, and an entire propaganda machine operating like an extremist media company. On the map, the areas they controlled were divided into wilayat, provinces, stretching from Iraq into Syria, each with courts, religious police, prisons, and a tax collection system. On paper and in their propaganda videos, they tried to make the world believe this was a normal state, just one with bloodier laws. Behind that apparatus was a vast looting machine. When it took Mosul, IS stormed into banks and treasuries and carried off hundreds of millions of dollars in cash. It seized oil fields and sold oil on the black market through smuggling routes that had existed since wartime. Businesses, drivers, and religious minority communities were extorted, heavily taxed, and kidnapped for ransom. Internally, many former officers of the Ba'ath regime brought with them military security and intelligence expertise. Many jihadists brought with them ideological networks and international connections. The result was a structure that combined the discipline of a secular army with the fanatical drive of jihadism. From the perspective of a young Sunni man in Iraq or Syria at that time, the story appeared differently. You grew up in a neighborhood crushed by war, viewed with suspicion by the new state, humiliated by corrupt police. You saw online videos talking about an ideal Islamic State, where Sunnis were respected, where justice was carried out swiftly, where you could become a fighter instead of an invisible, unemployed nobody. For some, that was the promise of having their dignity restored. For foreign fighters from Europe or North Africa, it was a chance to start over in a place where every question had a simple answer. Either you are with us or you are the enemy. And it was precisely this mixture of hurt, exclusion, and black and white promises that filled the ranks of the infamous terrorist organization known as IS. In the same period when IS captured Mosul in Iraq and turned Raqqa in Syria into the capital of the Caliphate, the first thing that changed was not the map on television, but the landscape of a very ordinary day in the eyes of the people. The national flag was lowered. The black flag was raised over government buildings. The signs of state offices, schools, police stations were repainted, replaced with the logo and slogans of the Islamic State. Loudspeakers on mosque roofs and on pickup trucks began to announce new regulations, curfews, dress codes, punishments for theft, for insulting religion. At the same time, IS opened Sharia courts, set up tax offices, and established the religious police force, Hizbah, to patrol the streets. In that context, everyday life did not disappear, but was bent to fit the laws of the Caliphate. Markets still opened, bread was still baked, fuel was still sold, children still ran and played in dusty alleys. But above them were propaganda cameras, gunmen with rifles standing at roundabouts, and notice boards listing flogging penalties for anyone who smoked or skipped prayers. Schools in some places remained open, but the curriculum was adjusted, classes were segregated by gender, and religious content was intensified. In hospitals, doctors and nurses had to rearrange their schedules, men treating men, women treating women, under the watchful eye of religious monitors. For women, the lines of text on paper very quickly turned into concrete limits on their bodies. Dress was tightened, full head coverings, long robes, gloves, face veils. In many areas, going out of the house required a male relative to accompany them. Jobs that had once opened up opportunities, teachers, health workers, office staff, were narrowed and then disappeared. Many had to stop working, living in complete dependency, reduced to shadows behind doors, while over the loudspeakers the new state still proudly spoke of protecting women's virtue. For young men, the pressure to follow the path of the fighter was everywhere. Posters, sermons, online clips all told the same story. This is the only place you can become a hero. In Mosul or Raqqa, many 16 to 17-year-old boys were invited to attend religious training courses and were quickly sent on to military camps. There were mothers who hid their sons at home, telling neighbors he was sick, to avoid having him put on a recruitment list. While outside, recruitment teams went door to door, promising salaries, weapons, and glory. Parallel to that daily life was a propaganda campaign, unprecedented in scale for a terrorist organization. IS produced high-quality videos, glossy magazines, and images of families living stable lives in its areas of control. Supermarkets full of goods, children memorizing the Quran, fighters portrayed as guardians of order. The goal was to send the message: this is not a rebel group, but a real state, with laws, institutions, and its own order. But right alongside those staged images was public violence used as a language of governance. Executions in the street, hands cut off before crowds, people accused of being gay thrown from rooftops, bodies hung in squares. All were filmed, edited, and circulated as part of the system. For local residents, that was a threat. This is the price if you resist. For extremists far away, it was presented as religious justice, carried out to the fullest. From the perspective of people raised in modern legal systems, there are questions that remain unanswered. Where does applying religious law end and a blood-soaked PR campaign begin? When a state has to rely on fear and on images of violence broadcast across the world in order to exist, is it still a political community, or only a factory of death wrapped in the language of order and morality? Precisely in those very ordinary days in Mosul and Raqqa, that question became reality for millions of people living under the black flag. If in the years 2014-2015 you followed the news about IS, you probably heard the phrase Yazidi people in passing without really picturing who they were. On the map, they are just a small minority community living around the Sinjar mountain area in northern Iraq near the Syrian border. But if you zoom in closer, they are farming villages, families clinging to the mountain slopes, with a faith of their own that has existed for centuries, passed down orally and preserved through festivals, music, and clothing. Precisely because they are different, they have repeatedly been labeled heretics, infidels, becoming an easy target to be sacrificed whenever the region falls into violence. Before 2014, life in Sinjar was not peaceful, but it still had its own rhythm. Men worked the fields and herded livestock. Women went to the market, took care of the children, kept family rituals. Children went to school, even if the facilities were rudimentary. Mount Sinjar was not just a place on the map, but part of a spiritual identity, a place where the Yazidi believe their identity is tied to that land, to the cemeteries on the slopes, to the small temples nestled among rock and dust. They knew they were a minority, but still believed that if they held on to the mountain, they would survive yet another cycle of violence. In August 2014, that cycle of violence suddenly turned into a planned campaign of genocide. After seizing Mosul, IS turned to attack the Sinjar area. The Kurdish protection forces retreated in chaos, in many places almost without time to organize a defense. When the pickup trucks with black flags drove into the villages, civilians had almost no choice. Many families tried to flee up the mountain at night, bringing a few bottles of water and some bread. The elderly and the sick, unable to leave in time, were left behind in the villages, facing directly the army that was advancing. In the accounts recorded later, a pattern repeats itself. Men and older boys were separated into one group. Women and girls were herded off to another side. The men were taken to the edge of the village, out into the fields, or to hastily dug pits. Many were shot on the spot. Later, when other forces retook the area, they found numerous mass graves, from small pits with a few dozen bodies to larger burial sites. For many Yazidi families, a day in August 2014 is a clear dividing line. Before that, they had fathers, brothers, sons. After that, there was only a list of the missing and a mountain full of anonymous graves. Meanwhile, women and girls were loaded onto vehicles and taken to towns under IS control. From the perspective of those who planned the campaign, they were spoils of war. In internal propaganda materials, IS justified taking Yazidi women as sex slaves as a wartime tradition they were reviving. In reality, it was a human trafficking network run as part of the state. Women were sold, traded among fighters, forced to convert, and repeatedly raped. Many girls were moved from prison to prison, from Iraq to Syria, like goods being transferred within a system that no one outside could control. The United Nations and many human rights organizations have called what happened in Sinjar by its proper name: war crimes and genocide. Not only because of the number of people killed, but because of the structure of the violence. Men were dealt with in a way that erased the community's ability to reproduce itself. Women were used as tools to shatter honor, families, and traditions. Children were separated from their parents. Many were raised in the IS environment, taught the language, flag, and songs of those who had killed their families. This was not random violence, but a blueprint aimed directly at the existence of the Yazidi as a distinct group. If we stop at the numbers, it is very easy to confuse one massacre with another. But behind each line of statistics are specific stories. A girl recounts the moment she was pulled from her mother's arms at a checkpoint, only managing to see the scarf on her mother's head slip off before she disappeared. A man who survived a mass grave says he escaped death only because he was shielded by the bodies of his own relatives. When you listen to these testimonies, you are no longer in the position of someone looking at a campaign map, but of someone trying to walk with them along every meter of ground leading up the mountain. In that context, Mount Sinjar is not just geography. It became a symbol of abandonment. Tens of thousands of people were driven up its slopes, trapped between scorching heat, thirst, hunger, and surrounded by IS forces below. Images of planes dropping water and aid, images of humanitarian corridors opened by Syrian Kurdish forces to rescue part of the Yazidi population are proof of international efforts. But for families who lost loved ones in those first days, every helicopter that arrived later carried the bitter taste of being too late. When looking back at Sinjar, the question is not only, why didn't we intervene earlier, but also, what is happening in the minds of those who call themselves a state? When they pre-design columns for taking slaves, mass graves, erasing a community as part of their power structure. If a political entity can plan to enslave women, turn children into spoils of war, decide who gets to live and who is erased from the map solely because of their faith, can we still argue over what it is? Organization, movement, state, all labels become empty when placed next to Sinjar. There, only one reality remains. That ideology, when combined with a power vacuum, can turn a small community living quietly by a mountain into the target of a barbaric, systematically planned campaign of genocide. When we talk about IS, it is very easy to see only two extremes. On one side are the black flags and the gruesome propaganda videos. On the other side are the battle maps with the arrows of the international coalition. But what lies between those two images? Cities ground to dust. Families forced to run back and forth between front lines just to stay alive one more day. The war against IS, if you look closely, is not only a military story, but a story about the price ordinary civilians have to pay to pull a state built on blood off the map. Not long after IS seized Mosul and declared a caliphate in 2014, the international response did not come from a single country, but from a complex network. The United States led the air campaign. On the ground, Kurdish forces in Iraq and Syria, the Iraqi army, local militias, and later the Syrian Democratic Forces (SDF) became the ones directly facing IS. Names like Kobane, Mosul, Raqqa, Baghouz began to appear constantly in the news. No longer just unfamiliar place names on a Middle East map, but life-or-death choke points in the fight against the most dangerous extremist organization of that moment. Urban warfare against IS was a particularly dirty and difficult kind of war. Unlike an army standing out in the desert, IS hid in every alley, every apartment block, every basement. In Mosul or Raqqa, each house could be a bunker. Each narrow street could hold mines, roadside bombs, explosive traps. When the coalition moved in, they faced not only snipers but also tunnel systems, passageways between buildings, and densely laid minefields. A single bridge and intersection, a hospital, could become a hotspot contested for weeks. To slow the advance of their opponents, IS used tactics that many other armed groups had employed before, but on a much more cold-blooded scale. They turned civilians into human shields. Many reports describe families forced to stay in their homes, forbidden to evacuate, so that, if the coalition launched airstrikes, images of civilian corpses would become propaganda tools. When an organization that calls itself a state is willing to turn the very people in its territory into obstacles for bombs and bullets, we see very clearly the nature of the order it wants to build. In each specific battle, the price paid was always higher than the dry numbers. Kobane, a small Kurdish town in Syria, became the first symbol when local forces held out against IS from late 2014 to early 2015 under supporting airstrikes. Mosul, once a cultural and economic center, was heavily devastated in the campaign to retake the city from 2016 to 2017. Old quarters were flattened, bridges collapsed, whole parts of the city looked as if they had just gone through an earthquake. Raqqa, IS's self-proclaimed capital in Syria, suffered a similar fate. By the time the black flags were pulled down, what remained was mostly rubble and residential areas that were barely recognizable. Many families in Mosul recount having to hang white cloths in their windows, trying to signal that they were civilians. Mothers clutching their children ran through smoke-filled alleys, not knowing whether what lay ahead was a way out or a minefield. In Sinjar and the surrounding areas, surviving Yazidis had to watch as their villages were liberated, but at the same time almost erased from the map. Homes destroyed, fields abandoned, mass graves hastily marked with wooden stakes. Militarily, IS gradually lost territory. Month after month, international maps recolored areas that had been under the black flag. By 2019, when Baghouz, the last IS stronghold in Syria, fell, many leaders declared that the self-proclaimed Islamic State has been defeated. In terms of control over land, that was true. But if we stop there, we will miss the hardest part. IS's extremist ideology and underground network did not suddenly disappear along with those square meters of territory. Sleeper cells, support networks, propaganda forums continued trying to survive in the post-war vacuum, from refugee camps in Syria and Iraq to the dark corners of the internet. Looking back at the war against IS, especially through the lens of the cities that were crushed, we see one thing: a state built on blood cannot be erased by bombs and guns alone. If, after the gun smoke clears, the communities that were victims still have no justice, no reconstruction, if the power vacuum remains, then the soil for another extremist organization to grow on does not disappear at all. When the maps on television began to gradually erase the black areas of the Islamic State, many people far away felt as if the story had come to an end. But if you lower the lens down to the ground, what remains after victory are refugee camps stretching all the way to the horizon. Tents packed tightly together, barbed wire fences, lines of people waiting for food. Families from Mosul, Raqqa, Sinjar are mixed together, carrying very different pasts but sharing the same present. No home, no clear future. Children born in areas once controlled by IS have no valid birth certificates, no nationality, and many countries hesitate to take them back. For the Yazidis, the years after 2014 were not a journey home, but a process of learning to live with an open wound. The women who escaped sexual slavery carry within themselves both personal pain and a sense of guilt for having survived, while many relatives disappeared. They walk into conference rooms and courtrooms, recounting what happened in occupied houses and secret slave markets, hoping the world will call the crimes they suffered by their proper name. In parallel, groups within the community exhume mass graves, identify remains, piece together lists of the missing so that at least each family knows where to place a headstone. On paper, IS has lost its territory, but it has not disappeared. In Iraq and Syria, underground cells still operate, launching sporadic attacks and then retreating into rural areas, into the desert. In cyberspace, propaganda channels continue to circulate videos and slogans, trying to keep the story of an ideal state alive in the imagination of disaffected youth. Therefore, when we say, the Caliphate has collapsed, that is true on the map and in official statements, but not enough to close the file. In the bodies of tortured women, in the jolted sleep of children growing up in refugee camps, in the memories of communities that were targeted, the fragments of that state are still there. If those gaps continue to be filled with injustice, violence, and oblivion, then the story of a self-proclaimed extremist state has probably only paused, not truly ended. When we look back at the story of the self-proclaimed Islamic State, there are 3 lessons we can hardly ignore if we do not want to repeat this spiral under another name. First, wherever there is a power vacuum and a community that has been collectively humiliated, extremism almost always finds room to live. In Iraq, that was the sense of being punished felt by many Sunnis after 2003. In Syria, it was the areas abandoned between front lines. When the state weakens, courts lose credibility, and the police are seen as tools of one faction or another, the promise, "we will bring swift justice," suddenly becomes attractive, even when it comes with a black flag. Second, any state that begins by removing minorities and pushing women out of public space stands very close to the brink of genocide, no matter what religious language or ideology it wraps itself in. From Kabul to Mosul, from the Hazaras to the Yazidis, the pattern repeats in a chilling way. When a government treats erasing a community from the map as reordering, we are no longer talking about normal politics, but standing in front of a crime machine. Third, forgetting the victims is never neutral. When we allow mass graves to be covered over hastily, leave Yazidi women to struggle with trauma on their own, let children born in the Caliphate grow up without papers, we are laying the groundwork for a new cycle. Extremism does not emerge from a vacuum. It grows out of the feeling of being abandoned, of being treated as invisible. If you have already watched the Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi video on my channel about an individual sliding into extremism, then this episode shows that one person alone is not enough to create a state. It takes prolonged war, power vacuums, the wrong decisions of great powers, and the indifference of the international community to early warnings about Sinjar, about sexual slavery, about lists of the disappeared. Ideology only turns into a machine when it has both structure and the negligence of those standing on the outside. Therefore, the final question is not only for the Middle East, but for all of us. Where is the line between counterterrorism and protecting the rights of minority communities? Where is the line between restoring order and building a state based on fear? Every time we accept sacrificing women, minorities, refugees, in exchange for a quick sense of safety, we move closer to another version of the same tragedy. If you believe that stories like those of the Yazidis, of communities trapped in the shadows of a self-proclaimed state, deserve to be retold rather than buried in the old news section, please subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, and share this video. YouTube may not prioritize heavy content like this, but every like, every comment, every share from you is a way of telling the world that these people should not be forgotten. And who knows, maybe from these small conversations, we learn how to recognize a state built on blood, right from its earliest stirrings.